She wasn't supposed to be there. The schedule said the suite would be empty until 10. She had 40 minutes, enough time to clean, restock, and disappear, the way she always did. But when the door opened behind her, every muscle in her body went still. She turned slowly. Dan Mackenzie stood in the doorway, the most dangerous man in the building, maybe in the city. He didn't move. He just watched her, with eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. "Come here, let me show you something." She didn't know if it was an order or an invitation. She didn't know if she was safe, but something in his voice told her that whatever he was about to show her would change everything. The vacuum hummed low against the marble. Anne Howard worked in silence, the way she always did. Head down, hands steady, invisible. That was the point. In a place like the Meridian, a hotel that existed somewhere between luxury and secrecy, the staff were ghosts. You cleaned. You vanished. You never looked anyone in the eye unless they asked you a question. And even then, you kept your answers short. Anne had learned this in her first week. And she'd smiled at a guest once, a man in a gray suit who smelled like cigars and the old money. And Miriam, the head of housekeeping, had pulled her aside with a grip like a vice. "You don't exist here, Anne. That's how you stay safe." She hadn't smiled at a guest since. Now it was 9:30 on a Tuesday night, and she was inside Suite 1, the penthouse floor, the room no one talked about, the room that belonged to him, Dan Mackenzie, owner of the Meridian, owner of Vake. According to the quiet rumors that circulated through the staff hallways, like smoke, a great deal more than that. Anne had cleaned this suite twice before, always on Tuesdays, always between 9 and 10, when the schedule confirmed he was out. She'd been told never to touch his desk, never to open the closet on the west wall, and never, under any circumstances, to remain past 10:15. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The suite was enormous. 3 rooms, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, dark wood, leather, the faint scent of something she couldn't name, amber, maybe, or sandalwood. Everything was immaculate, not in the way of a man who hired people to clean, in the way of a man who kept order as a form of control. She was finishing the bathroom, wiping the mirror in long, practiced strokes, when she heard the door. Not the soft click of the service entrance she'd come through. Woody, the front door. The heavy one, and the one that required a key card only 3 people in the building possessed. Anne's hand stopped mid-stroke. She set the cloth down slowly, as if any sudden movement might change the nature of what was about to happen. Her pulse ticked upward. She stepped out of the bathroom and into the main room. Dan Mackenzie stood in the doorway. He was taller than she remembered from the one time she'd seen him cross the lobby, 6'2", maybe more, though with the kind of frame that looked like it had been built for something harder than wearing tailored suits. Dark hair, cut close, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the hotel's facade. His eyes were gray, not the soft, uncertain gray of clouds. The gray of gunmetal, of winter rivers. He was looking at her. Not through her, not past her, at her. The silence stretched. 2 seconds, 5. Anne's fingers curled at her sides. She should apologize. She should explain that she was on the cleaning schedule, that she'd be out in 3 minutes, that she was sorry for the intrusion. She opened her mouth. He spoke first. "Come here." His voice was low, not loud, not threatening exactly, but it carried the weight of a man who was never refused. Anne didn't move. He tilted his head just slightly. Then he stepped to the side and gestured toward the hallway behind him, toward something she couldn't see. Let me show you something." Every instinct told her to leave, to mutter an excuse and walk past him and clock out and never clean this suite again. But something in his expression held her, a flicker behind the gunmetal, not cruelty, not desire, something closer to urgency. She set down the cloth. She walked toward him. He led her into the hallway outside the suite, to a door she'd always assumed was a utility closet. And he pressed his thumb to a small panel on the wall, biometric, and the door clicked open. Inside was a room she had never seen on any floor plan. Small, windowless, lit by a single desk lamp. A wall of monitors displayed camera feeds from every floor of the hotel. On the desk sat a phone, a glass of water, and a manila folder. Dan picked up the folder. He held it out to her. "This man," he said. "Do you know him?" Anne took the folder. Inside was a photograph, grainy, pulled from a security camera, of a man in a dark coat standing in the hotel lobby. Her stomach dropped. She knew him. Victor Salcedo. The man who had loaned her $4,000 6 months ago, when her brother Eli's medical bills had swallowed everything she had. The man who had promised flexible repayment terms and then, 2 months later, had started calling at midnight, showing up outside her apartment building, leaving notes under her door with numbers that grew larger every week. And the man who, last Thursday, had grabbed her wrist outside the subway and whispered that there were other ways to repay a debt. Anne stared at the photograph. Her hands were trembling. She hated that, the trembling. It betrayed everything she worked so hard to hide. "He came into my hotel," Dan said. His voice hadn't changed in volume or pitch, but something in it had hardened. "Twice this week. Asked about you at the front desk, described you, your name, your shift." Anne looked up. How do you—" "I know everything that happens in this building." He paused. "And I know when someone is hunting." The word landed between them like a stone in still water. "Sit down," Dan said. It wasn't a command exactly, more like a man who could see that her legs were about to give out. He pulled a chair from behind the desk. Anne sat. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop the shaking. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of this man she did not know and did not trust and had no reason to believe would help her. "Tell me everything," Dan said. "Start from the beginning," she told him, not because she wanted to, not because she trusted him, but because she was so tired of carrying it alone that when someone finally asked, really asked, with eyes that didn't flinch, the words came out like water through a crack in a dam. She told him about Eli, 8 years old. Her half-brother, technically, same mother, different father, both long gone. He'd been diagnosed with a congenital heart condition at age 5. The first surgery had been covered barely by a patchwork of charity care and a fundraiser organized by their neighbor, Mrs. Okafor. But the second surgery, the one the doctors said he needed before he turned 9, cost more than Anne would make in 3 years. She told him about the loan, how she'd found Salcedo through a friend of a friend, how the terms had seemed almost reasonable at first, how the interest had ballooned, how the calls had started. She told him about the apartment on Delancey Street, the one with the radiator that only worked half the time and the window that didn't lock, about the after-school program that watched Eli while she worked her double shifts, about Mrs. Okafor, who checked on him in the evenings, about the way Eli asked every single night when Anne would be home, and how most nights the answer was late, "Buddy, but I'll be there when you wake up." She told him about the bruise on her wrist, the one she'd covered with a long-sleeved shirt even though it was June. Through all of it, Dan Mackenzie sat motionless. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort or reassurance or any of the things people said when they wanted you to stop talking about your problems. He just listened, with those gray eyes fixed on her, absorbing every word like a man cataloging facts. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "How much do you owe him?" Dan asked. $7,000. He says 12 now, with interest." "He's lying. The interest is fabricated. His entire operation is unlicensed." Dan's jaw tightened. "He preys on people who can't afford lawyers." Anne looked at him. "And what do you do?" It was a reckless question. She knew what the rumors said. She knew the kind of men who owned hotels like this, who had biometric locks on hidden rooms and walls of surveillance monitors. She asked anyway. Dan held her gaze. "I do a great many things that most people would rather not know about." A beat. But I don't hurt people who don't deserve it. That's what they all say. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, almost respect, like he was recalibrating something in his assessment of her. He'd expected her to be afraid. She was. But she was also the kind of afraid that turned sharp instead of soft. You're right to be skeptical, he said. But here's what I can tell you. Victor Salcedo operates out of a storefront on 138th Street. He has 11 active loans right now, all to people in situations like yours. He's connected to a man named Jorge Pena, who runs the collections side, and Pena is not the kind of man who sends letters. Anne's blood went cold. Salcedo came to my hotel, Dan continued, even which means he either doesn't know whose building this is or he doesn't care. Either way, he's made a mistake. Why do you care? The question hung in the air. Dan stood. He walked to the monitors, his back to her. On one of the screens, she could see the lobby, bright, polished, a bellhop pushing a luggage cart. My mother cleaned rooms, he said without turning around. In a hotel a lot worse than this one. She worked 16-hour days. She never complained. When I was 10. And the manager decided she owed him a different kind of labor. His voice was perfectly even, as if he were reading from a transcript. She couldn't fight back because she needed the job. She needed the job because of me. He turned. No one helped her. I was a child. I couldn't do anything. His eyes found Anne's. I'm not a child anymore. Anne understood then, not fully. There were layers to this man. She would need months, maybe years to understand. But she understood the engine that drove him. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't charity. It was something older and more dangerous. It was a debt that could never be repaid, owed to a woman who could no longer collect. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to make Victor Salcedo forget your name, Dan said. And I'm going to make sure he never remembers it again. Over the following week, something changed in the architecture of Anne's days. She still arrived at 6 a.m., and she still cleaned rooms. She still changed linens and scrubbed bathroom tiles and emptied waste baskets while her knees ached and her back screamed. But now she was aware, in a way she hadn't been before, of being seen. Not by the guests, by the building itself. The first morning after their conversation, she found a new pair of work shoes in her locker. Her size. The kind with reinforced soles that cost $80. She'd looked at them once in a store window and then kept walking. There was no note. 2 days later, Miriam told her she'd been reassigned from the overnight shift to the day shift. Management decision, Miriam said, with an expression that made it clear she'd been told not to elaborate. Anne noticed other things. The security guard near the staff entrance, a man named Rowan, with thick arms and a permanently neutral expression, had started walking her to the subway each night. He didn't say much, just fell into step beside her, hands in his pockets, and didn't leave until she'd gone through the turnstile. When she asked him why, he shrugged. Boss's orders. And Dan himself. She didn't see him often. He moved through the hotel like weather, present everywhere but visible only when he chose to be. But sometimes when she was restocking a supply closet or passing through a corridor, she'd feel a shift in the air, and she'd look up and he'd be there, at the end of a hallway, in a doorway, or never approaching, just present. And his eyes would meet hers for a fraction of a second, not predatory, not possessive, but with an attention so focused it was almost physical. And then he'd be gone. It unnerved her. It also, in a way, she refused to examine too closely, made her feel safer than she had in months. On the 5th day, Anne was arranging flowers in the lobby, a task she'd volunteered for because she liked working with her hands and the lobby was warm. When a man sat down in one of the armchairs near the window, she didn't look up at first. Then she heard him clear his throat. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned. The man was mid-40s, thick-necked, wearing a suit that was expensive but poorly fitted. He smiled at her. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for a young woman who works here. Anne Howard." You wouldn't happen to know her?" The flowers trembled in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm new. I don't know most of the staff." The man studied her. His smile widened. "That's funny," he said, "because you match her description exactly." Before Anne could respond, a shadow fell across the man's chair, not metaphorically, a literal shadow, large, dark, and attached to a body that blocked out the light from the window. "Rowan." "Sir," Rowan said, in a voice that contained all the warmth of a closed fist. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked up, calculated, reconsidered. "Just asking for directions," he said, and stood, and left. Anne's hands were shaking again. Rowan looked at her, and for the first time, his neutral expression softened into something almost gentle. "Go take your break," he said. "I'll handle the flowers." She nodded. She went upstairs, and she locked herself in the staff bathroom and pressed her back against the door and breathed. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. That was Jorge Pena. "He works for Salcedo. Don't worry, he won't come back." She stared at the message. She didn't know how Dan Mackenzie had gotten her number. She didn't know how he'd known about Pena's visit within minutes. She didn't text back, but she saved the number. 3 days later, Dan found her. She was in the staff kitchen on the second floor, Bosses, eating a sandwich she'd made at home, peanut butter, no jelly, because jelly was an expense, and reading a book she'd borrowed from the public library. It was 10 p.m. Her shift was over, but she was waiting for Rowan to finish his rounds so he could walk her to the subway. Dan appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a dark coat over a dark shirt, and he looked like he'd been somewhere that required both. His knuckles, she noticed, were red. "Come with me," he said. Where?" "Downstairs." "I don't go places without knowing where I'm going." He paused. Again that flicker, the one that might have been respect. "The hotel has a lower level, below the basement. I want to show you something that concerns your brother." Eli's name was the key that turned every lock she had. She put down her sandwich. She followed him. They took a service elevator to a floor she hadn't known existed. The doors opened onto a long corridor, surprisingly well lit, and with polished concrete floors and recessed lighting. It didn't feel like a basement. It felt like a place someone had deliberately hidden behind the face of the building. Dan walked ahead, and she followed, past a series of closed doors, until they reached one at the end of the hallway. He opened it. Inside was an office. Not like the surveillance room. This was warmer, more human. A wooden desk, bookshelves lined with actual books. History, philosophy, poetry, and their spines cracked from reading. A record player in the corner. On the wall, a single framed photograph of a woman with dark hair and tired eyes who looked like she'd once been beautiful and was now simply enduring. His mother. Anne knew it without asking. "Sit," Dan said, and this time the word was softer. He sat behind the desk and placed a folder in front of her. She opened it. Inside were medical documents, her brother's medical documents, his diagnosis, his treatment history, in his surgical projections. And beneath them, a letter from Dr. Miriam Torres at Columbia Presbyterian, one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. The letter confirmed an appointment for Eli Howard in 2 weeks. Anne read it twice, 3 times. The numbers at the bottom, the ones that detailed the cost of the procedure, had a line drawn through them. Beside the line in handwriting she didn't recognize were 3 words: "Taken care of." She looked up, her vision blurred. How did you... I have resources. I can't accept this." "You can. You don't understand. I don't take things from people. I don't..." Her voice cracked. She pressed her lips together, hard, and looked at the ceiling. Dan was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. "Anne, look at me." She did. His gray eyes were steady. There was no pity in them. Pity would have broken her. What she found instead was something she couldn't name, a gravity, a certainty, and as if he had made a decision about her place in his world, and nothing would unmake it. "This is not a gift," he said, "and it is not a debt. I am not Salcedo. I will never come to collect." He paused. "Your brother is 8 years old. He deserves to turn 9. That's all this is." Anne stared at him. The tears came then, not the weak, defeated kind she'd fought against for months, but the kind that come when something you've been holding breaks open and the thing underneath is not pain, but relief. She put her face in her hands and wept. Dan didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He sat on the other side of the desk, still as stone, and waited. When she finally lifted her head, eyes red, breath ragged, he slid a glass of water across the desk. "Drink." She drank. "Now," he said, "Dana, we need to discuss Salcedo." What Dan told her that night rearranged her understanding of the world she'd been surviving in. Victor Salcedo was not merely a loan shark. He was a node in a network, a sprawling, rotting system of exploitation that stretched across 3 boroughs. The network was funded by a man named Councilman Raymond Birch, a politician who presented himself as a champion of low-income communities while quietly profiting from their desperation. The Birch funneled money through shell companies to men like Salcedo, who offered predatory loans to the most vulnerable people in the city: single mothers, immigrants without documents, the elderly on fixed incomes. The interest rates were criminal. The collection methods were worse. Dan had been watching Birch for 2 years. "Why?" Anne asked. "Because Birch tried to buy this hotel," Dan said. "And when I refused to sell, he sent men to persuade me. One of them put a colleague of mine in the hospital." His voice was flat, controlled. "I don't forget things like that." "So this is revenge?" "Partly." He met her eyes. "Partly it's the fact that Birch destroys people like you for profit, and I find that unacceptable." Anne turned this over in her mind. She was sitting in the hidden office of a man the world called a criminal, being told that another criminal, one who wore a suit and sat on a city council, was the real monster. It should have felt absurd. Instead, it felt like the truest thing anyone had told her in years. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Dan's eyebrows rose. "I didn't ask for anything. You showed me the file. You told me about Birch. You didn't do that just to inform me." She leaned forward. "What do you need?" For the first time since she'd known him, Dan Mackenzie almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his mouth, but it was there in his eyes, a warmth that cracked through the permafrost like the first day of spring. "You're right," he said. "I need a witness, someone who can testify to Salcedo's practices. The threats, the fabricated interest, the intimidation. I have records, but records don't have faces. Juries believe faces. You're building a case. I'm building a bomb. Birch's entire funding structure runs through Salcedo's operation. If Salcedo falls, the money trail leads straight to Birch. And I have a contact in the district attorney's office who has been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence." Anne sat with this. The room was very quiet. She could hear the faint hum of the building above them, the hotel going about its business, guests sleeping in expensive beds, none of them knowing what was happening beneath their feet. "If I testify," she said, "Salcedo will come after me. He will try." And Dan's expression settled into something she recognized, and the look of a man who had been underestimated his entire life and had made that underestimation into a weapon. "He will fail," Dan said. The days that followed were a strange kind of suspended animation, ordinary on the surface, charged beneath. Anne continued to work her shifts. She cleaned rooms, she folded towels. She smiled at Miriam and ate her peanut butter sandwiches and called Eli every night at 8, the way she always did. On the phone, Eli told her about a book he was reading about dinosaurs, and she listened and laughed and didn't tell him that in 2 weeks, a surgeon was going to repair his heart. She didn't tell him about Dan either. But Dan was there, always there, in the periphery. She'd catch glimpses, his reflection in a polished surface, his voice low in a hallway, the scent of amber in a room he'd recently left. And twice more, he came to find her. The first time, He brought her to the hidden office, and they went over her statement together. He was meticulous, patient, asking her to describe each interaction with Salcedo in precise detail. He never rushed her. When she stumbled, when the memory of Salcedo's hand on her wrist made her voice go thin and breakable, Dan would stop. "Take your time," he'd say, nothing more. The second time, he didn't bring her to the office. He brought her to the roof. It was midnight. The city stretched below them like a circuit board, all light and movement, indifferent and beautiful. The wind was warm. Anne stood at the railing and felt, for a moment, like she was above everything that had ever weighed her down. Dan stood beside her, a careful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to let her breathe. "Do you come up here often?" she asked. "When I need to remember that the world is larger than the things I'm involved in." She glanced at him. His profile was sharp against the skyline, all angles and control, but his hands resting on the railing were loose, unguarded. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask. The photograph in your office, your mother, is she? She died when I was 17. He said it the way he said most things, like a fact, stripped of ornamentation. "Stroke. She was 41. I'm sorry. She worked herself to death." He paused. I've spent every year since trying to build a world where that doesn't have to happen to anyone else. I've done it badly, most of the time, with methods that she wouldn't have approved of. But the intention is hers." Anne studied him in the amber glow of the city lights. He was not, she realized, what she had expected when she had first heard his name whispered in the staff hallways. He was not simple. He was not safe, but he was not what they said he was either. And he was something more complicated. A man who had turned his grief into a structure and lived inside it, protecting the people he could reach, punishing the people who took advantage of the powerless. She would be proud of the intention, Anne said. I think she'd understand the methods. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had that first night in the suite. Not through her, not past her, but into her, as if she were a language he was still learning to read. 18, you're the first person who's ever said that to me, he said. Then you've been talking to the wrong people. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, and might not say for a long time. The wind moved between them. The city hummed. Anne felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known was there. She didn't name it, not yet, but she knew it was there. Eli's surgery was scheduled for a Thursday. Anne took the day off, the first day she'd taken off in over a year. She sat in the waiting room at Columbia Presbyterian in a plastic chair, with her hands clasped between her knees, and she waited. Mrs. Okafor sat beside her, knitting something small and blue, a hat for Eli, she said, for when he came home. Mrs. Okafor was 72 years old, and she had been more of a mother to Anne than any woman connected to her by blood. She didn't ask where the money for the surgery had come from. She simply said, "God provides," and went on knitting. The surgery took 4 hours. When Dr. Torres came out, she was smiling. Anne's vision went white at the edges. She heard the words, successful, strong, recovery, but they reached her as if from a great distance, through water, through years of fear. Eli was going to be all right. Anne excused herself. She walked down the corridor to a stairwell, sat on the steps, and called the number she'd saved. Dan answered on the first ring. He's okay, she said. Her voice broke on the second word. There was a pause, then, good. That was all he said. One word, but she could hear something in it. A thread of relief, so thin it was almost invisible, stretched across the silence like a wire. Thank you, she said. I know you said it's not a debt, but I need you to hear it anyway. I hear you. She wanted to say more. She wanted to say that he had changed the shape of her world, that he had taken a situation she'd been drowning in and pulled her to the surface with hands that were strong enough to crush, but had chosen instead to lift. She wanted to say that she saw him, not the reputation, Not the power, not the cold exterior, but the man underneath. The one who kept his mother's photograph on the wall and read poetry in a hidden room beneath a hotel and couldn't stand to watch someone suffer the way his mother had suffered. She didn't say any of it, not yet. I'll be back at work Monday, she said instead. Take the week. I don't need... Anne. His voice was gentle. It was the first time she'd heard that particular quality in it, and it stopped her mid-sentence. Take the week. Be with your brother. The hotel will survive without you. She closed her eyes. Okay. She didn't get the week. On Saturday night, 2 days after Eli's surgery, Anne was in her apartment on Delancey Street, sitting on the edge of Eli's bed, reading to him from the dinosaur book. He was propped up on pillows, his small chest wrapped in bandages, his eyes bright and alert despite everything. Read the part about the T-Rex again, he said. I've read it 3 times. 4 is better. She was halfway through the 4th reading when she heard the knock. Not at the apartment door, at the building's front entrance, 3 floors down. A heavy knock, the kind that didn't ask for permission. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Not Dan's, she answered. Miss Howard. The voice was smooth, unhurried, amused. My name is Jorge Pena. I believe you've been talking to people you shouldn't be talking to. Anne's blood turned to ice. I'm going to give you a choice, Pena continued. You can come downstairs and have a conversation with me, or I can come upstairs and have a conversation with your brother. She looked at Eli. He was watching her, the dinosaur book open on his lap, his eyes wide and trusting. I'll stay here, she told him. Don't move. I'll be right back. She went to the hallway. She called Dan. He answered before the first ring finished. Pena is outside my building, she said. Her voice was controlled now. The trembling had been replaced by something harder, colder, born of a simple truth. No one was going to threaten her brother. Not tonight. Not ever. I know, Dan said. Rowan is 3 minutes away. Do not go downstairs. Lock your door. Don't answer it for anyone you don't recognize. Dan! 3 minutes, Anne. I promise. She locked the door. She pulled Eli's dresser in front of it, the heavy oak one that Mrs. Okafor had found at a yard sale. She went back to Eli's room and sat beside him and picked up the dinosaur book. Where were we? She asked. Her hands were steady. The T-Rex, Eli said. Page 42. She read. When she read about the Cretaceous period and extinction events and fossilized bones while her heart hammered against her ribs and the clock on the wall counted the longest 3 minutes of her life. Then she heard it. Not a knock, but voices downstairs. Loud, then quieter, then silent. Her phone buzzed. It's handled. Open the door. She moved the dresser. She opened the door. Rowan stood in the hallway, his expression its usual unreadable mask. But his breathing was slightly elevated, and there was a split across one of his knuckles. He's gone, Rowan said. He won't come back. How can you be sure? Rowan looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been the certainty of a man who had seen how this particular story ended many times before. Because the boss doesn't make promises he can't keep. On Monday morning, Dan called her, and not to ask how she was, though she could hear the question lurking beneath his words. He called to tell her it was time. Salcedo is meeting with Birch tonight, he said, at a restaurant on the Upper East Side. My contact in the DA's office has a surveillance team in place. When the meeting ends, they'll move. And my testimony? The DA will call you tomorrow. You'll give a recorded statement. There will be protection detail assigned to you and your brother. Separate from my own. Separate from yours? This has to be clean, Anne. If my name is anywhere near this, Birch's lawyers will use it to poison the case. The evidence has to come through official channels. My involvement ends here. Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She gripped the phone harder. What do you mean, ends here? I mean, I've given the DA everything I have. The financial records, the communication transcripts, the connection between Salcedo and Birch. Once it's in their hands, it's no longer mine. But what about... She stopped. She wasn't sure what she was asking. What about the roof? What about the hidden office? What about the man who kept his mother's photograph on the wall? You'll be safe, Dan said. That's what matters. That's not all that matters, Anne said. Silence. She could hear him breathing, slow, controlled, the breath of a man who regulated every aspect of himself, because letting go, even for a moment, it felt like falling. We can talk about that later, he said finally, after this is over. The arrest made the 11 o'clock news. Anne watched it on the small television in her apartment. Eli asleep in the next room, Mrs. Okafor dozing in the armchair. She watched as Victor Salcedo was led out of a restaurant in handcuffs, his face contorted with fury. She watched as Councilman Raymond Birch was escorted from his brownstone by federal agents, his expression carefully blank. Edie, his lawyer, already at his side. She watched and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the shape of it. Safe. The next morning she gave her statement. A woman from the DA's office, calm, professional, with kind eyes, recorded everything. The midnight calls, the fabricated interest, the bruise on her wrist. Jorge Pena outside her building, all of it. When it was over, the woman closed her notebook and said, "You're very brave, Ms. Howard." Anne almost laughed. Brave. She'd been terrified every single day for 6 months. She hadn't been brave. She'd simply had no other option. 2 weeks passed. Salcedo was denied bail. Birch was suspended from the city council pending investigation. Pena, it turned out, had been picked up at a bus station in New Jersey, trying to flee. The network was unraveling, strand by strand, and with every strand, Anne breathed a little easier. Eli was recovering beautifully. He was back in school, in with restrictions. No running, no climbing, checkups every 2 weeks. But his color was good, and his energy was returning. He'd started drawing pictures of dinosaurs and taping them to the refrigerator, and every time Anne looked at them, she felt something luminous and fragile expanding in her chest. She went back to work at the Meridian. But the hotel felt different now. Or maybe she did. She moved through the halls with her shoulders back, her hands steady. She still cleaned rooms, and she still changed linens. But she no longer felt invisible. She didn't see Dan. Not for days. Not for a week. She looked for him, in hallways and doorways, in the spaces where he used to appear and disappear, like a change in atmospheric pressure. He wasn't there. She asked Rowan. "He's handling something," Rowan said, which told her nothing. On a Tuesday night, exactly 1 month, after the first time she'd heard those words in Suite 1, Anne was leaving the hotel. In she stepped out of the staff entrance and into the warm evening air, and he was there. Standing on the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, looking at her the way he always looked at her, as if she were the only thing in the frame, and everything else was background noise. "Walk with me," he said. They walked, through streets that were cooling in the dusk, past bodegas and brownstones, and trees heavy with summer leaves. They didn't speak for 3 blocks, and the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers assessing each other. It was the silence of 2 people who had been through something together and were still learning the language of what came after. Dan stopped outside a building on a quiet side street. It was a brownstone, modest, well-maintained, with a green door and a small garden in front. "What is this?" Anne asked. "It belongs to a friend of mine. She rents apartments. 2-bedroom, 2nd floor. Oh, good light. Radiator that works. Window that locks." He paused. "The rent is reasonable. The neighborhood is safe. There's a school 3 blocks east that has a program for children with medical needs." Anne stared at him. "Dan, it's not charity," he said. "The rent is market rate for the unit. You can afford it on your salary, especially with the raise that Miriam is processing." "What raise?" "The one that reflects what you're actually worth." She looked at the building. Green door. Garden. A window on the second floor where the light was on, warm and amber, like a promise. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not with suspicion. Not anymore. With the genuine, bewildered gratitude of a woman who had spent so long bracing for the worst that the presence of something good felt almost disorienting. Dan turned to her. In the fading light, his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. The angles were still there. The jaw, the sharp planes of his cheekbones, in the controlled set of his mouth. But his eyes had changed. The gunmetal had warmed. There was something behind it that she'd only seen in flashes before, on the rooftop, in the office, in the moments when his guard dropped just enough to let her glimpse what was beneath. "Come here," he said. She stepped toward him. "Let me show you something." He reached into his coat and took out a small, worn book. Poetry, she could see, the spine soft from years of handling. And he opened it to a page marked with a folded corner. "My mother used to read this to me," he said, "when I was very young, and the world felt too large. I didn't understand the words then. I understand them now." He held the book out to her. She took it. The page was marked with a single passage, underlined in pencil. The delicate, deliberate hand of a woman who had loved language even when the world had not been kind to her. Anne read it silently. The words were about shelter, not the kind made of walls and roofs, but the kind made of choosing, again and again, to protect something fragile in a world that wanted to break it. She closed the book. She held it against her chest. "This is what I want to show you," Dan said quietly. "Not the apartment, not the surgery, not the case against Birch." He held her gaze. "I want to show you that someone is standing here. Someone who isn't going anywhere. Someone who will not let the world break what you've built." Anne looked at him. This man of shadows and silence, of surveillance rooms and hidden offices, of violence contained and tenderness concealed. She looked at him and she saw, clearly, the shape of what they had become to each other. Not a transaction, not a rescue, but a recognition. Two people who had been carrying impossible weight, who had found, in the space between them, a place to set it down. She didn't say "I love you." That would come later, slowly, carefully, the way trust had grown between them. Through watched hallways and rooftop silences, and the sound of one person's breathing, steadying in the presence of another's. What she said was, "Show me the apartment." And she smiled. And it was the first real smile she had given anyone in a very long time. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in December, Anne sat at the kitchen table in the apartment with the green door while Eli drew dinosaurs at her feet. The apartment was warm. The radiator worked exactly as promised. The window was locked. On the refrigerator between Eli's drawings was a photograph from his last checkup. Eli grinning, a stethoscope around his neck, Dr. Torres kneeling beside him with an expression of genuine delight. Beside the photograph was another picture, one Mrs. Okafor had taken on Thanksgiving. Anne, Eli, or Rowan, who had turned out to be surprisingly talented at carving turkey, Miriam, who had brought 3 kinds of pie, and Dan. In the photograph, Dan was standing slightly behind the group, his expression its usual controlled mask, except for his eyes, which were looking at Anne, and which, if you knew what to look for, contained everything he had never learned to say out loud. Anne's phone buzzed, a message from Dan. Downstairs, brought coffee. And something for Eli. She went to the window and looked down. Dan stood on the sidewalk, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, a wrapped package under his arm. He was looking up at the window, and when he saw her, he lifted one of the cups in a gesture that was almost casual. But his eyes gave him away, the way they always did. Eli appeared beside her, pressing his nose against the glass. "Is that Mr. Dan?" "That's Mr. Dan." "Can he come up?" "He's already coming up." "Does he have a present?" "It looks like it. I bet it's a dinosaur book." "I bet it is too." There was a knock at the door, Anne went to answer it, and she was smiling before she reached the handle. Smiling because the apartment was warm, and her brother was healthy, and the man at the door carried coffee and children's books, and a kind of devotion that he expressed not through words but through acts, through presence. Through the daily, ordinary decision to be there. She opened the door. "Come in," she said. And Dan Mackenzie, the man they called a monster, the man who kept his mother's poetry in his coat pocket and surveilled loan sharks and funded surgeries for children he'd never met, stepped inside and set down the coffee and handed Eli the package and stood in the middle of Ann Howard's kitchen as if it were the only room in the world he had ever wanted to occupy. And for the first time in a very long time, the door closed not to keep something out, but to hold something in. Something whole, something warm, something found.